Welcome to Books of Our Time, brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss a book entitled The Brothers by Stephen Kinzer. The book is a dual biography of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, who led the United States into a series of foreign adventures whose effects have decisively shaped today's world. The book's author, Stephen Kinzer, is a contributor to the New York Review of Books, a columnist for the Boston Globe, and a former reporter for the New York Times, who has reported from more than 50 countries on 4 continents. He is with me today to discuss his book, and I am Lawrence R. Valvell, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Stephen, thank you for being here today. Maybe I misunderstood the book or took the wrong things from it, but I got the impression from the book that John Foster Dulles was about as unlovely a character as you could ever hope or not hope to meet. And so what I would like to ask first is, why did you choose to write about such an unlovely guy, or do I misunderstand him?
Well, unlovely would certainly be a gentle way of describing John Foster Dulles. Certainly in his personal and private life, he was very off-putting. He was arrogant and self-righteous and prudish. I read somewhere even his friends didn't like him. But I feel that this is a very important part of the untold story of America. So this was the only time in history that siblings, brothers, controlled the overt and the covert sides of American foreign policy. So John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles was head of the CIA. Together, they led America into a whole series of foreign interventions whose effects we are still dealing with. Why did I decide to focus on them? Well, first of all, it's remarkable to me what's happened to their reputation. During the 1950s, when they were at the peak of their power, they were immensely strong. They could send shock waves around the world. Just a wink and a nod between the two of them, and governments would shake and nations would crumble. There probably wasn't a literate human being on Earth who did not know the name Dulles. But now, they're almost completely forgotten. When I was working on this book, several times friends of mine would ask me, as they sometimes do, what are you working on now? What are you writing about? And I'd say, I'm writing a book about Dulles. And they would say, the airport? This is the extent to which they've fallen out of our public consciousness. Why is that? The Dulles approach to the world did not work out well for us. And perhaps rather than deal with that fact and see if there are some lessons we can draw from their misjudgments, it's easier just to airbrush them out of history. And my book is an attempt to strike back against that kind of historical amnesia.
You say here, apropos particularly of what you've been talking about, that understanding who they were and what they did is a key to uncovering the obscured roots of upheaval in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And then you say only long after the Dulles brothers died did the full consequences of their actions become clear. They may have believed that the countries in which they intervened would quickly become stable, prosperous, and free. More often, the opposite happened. Some of the countries they targeted have never recovered, nor has the world. Want to elaborate that just a little bit more? Some of the countries and some of the things that happened?
One of the great failures of imagination of the Dulles brothers and of their boss, President Eisenhower, was that they had no concept of what we would now call blowback. It never occurred to them that by charging into countries and overthrowing governments, they wouldn't be just affecting policy over a short term, but that these interventions would have huge long-term effects. We assume that since we forget about these interventions, the people in the target countries will also forget, but that doesn't happen. The memory of these interventions festers and burns in their hearts and their souls, and it can take years or decades or even generations before those tensions explode. But when you set off that time bomb in society, it will explode. So you asked for some examples. One of the most obvious ones as we look in today's paper has to do with Iran. We have been at a low-level war, essentially, with Iran for 35 years. And for Americans, the poison that has afflicted the U.S.-Iran relationship really was dumped into the wine of Concord in 1979 with the hostage crisis. As far as we're concerned, everything was going fine with Iran until the hostage crisis happened, which was all their fault, and then the relationship has spiraled down into this terrible self-defeating hostility. But Iranians don't see it that way. Iranians would say, well, the hostage crisis was one episode, but what really shaped our country was that we had a democracy here until 1953. Then the Dulles brothers charged in here, and since then, we have been under one form of dictatorship or another. So the Iran crisis, if you want to call it that, our long hostility with Iran, which has included the nuclear confrontation, can all be traced back to an intervention in 1953 organized by the Dulles brothers. If you multiply that times all the countries in the world where they intervened, you really can see a pattern of so many of today's crises emerging from short-sighted interventions that the Dulles brothers conceived and carried out.
Where was Eisenhower in all this?
Eisenhower's role is very interesting. He turns out to have been a militant supporter of covert action. It's not true that the Dulles brothers acted without his knowledge or behind his back. He knew everything they were doing, and he approved of it. Now, why was Eisenhower such a strong supporter of these covert operations? I think one reason we mentioned earlier, that it never occurred to him that this would have terrible effects in the long run. But he himself, of course, never spoke about why he favored covert action, because he never admitted that he did. He never admitted that there was any covert action. But I think if we could ask him today why he supported that, we can imagine a couple of things he might say. First of all, Eisenhower, as commander of American troops and Allied troops in the Second World War, would have realized something that the public didn't know, which was that secret operations played a big role in winning World War II, like the breaking of the German codes. So he must have come away from that war with an appreciation for what covert action could do. But I think there's another factor. Eisenhower probably would have considered covert action a kind of a peace project. Here was a guy who had to send kids off to die by the thousands. This must have weighed on him. Arriving in office, he finds the Dulles brothers presenting him with an alternative. You can get rid of a government and only 100 people will die, and none of them will be Americans, and it will only cost you a couple of $1 million. He must have thought of this as a huge breakthrough. So if you can imagine that you're achieving a security gain for the United States and there won't be any long-term negative effects, and you can do it so cheaply, I think something like that would have been very appealing to Eisenhower.
Yeah, yeah.
This is Frank Knight. May I introduce our co-editors for this edition of the Longines Chronoscope? Mr. William Bradford Huey, editor of the American Mercury, and Mr. Cecil Carnes, foreign correspondent and outstanding author. Our distinguished guest for this evening is Mrs. Claire Booth Luce, former United States representative from Connecticut.
Mrs. Luce, you, of course, are one of the most distinguished women in America, and I'm sure that our viewers will welcome your expressions tonight on the political campaign. I think that more women will vote for General Eisenhower.
Well, I think because women have a better instinct about character. They are not so concerned at a mental level with the issues, but they are very concerned with what kind of a man, what kind of a character he has. And I know that women instinctively feel enormous trust in Eisenhower's capacity to lead them and their nation and their families to a better America.
Will he appeal to their minds as well as to their intuition?
Well, of course, yes, because women are also interested in the issues.
On Korea, for instance, do you think women are particularly interested in an issue like Korea?
I think it would be hard to say that a father is less interested in what happens to his son than a mother. But in a way that is true, and I do think that women are more concerned by the fact that We've had 19,000 of our boys killed and 90,000 wounded, and there are 13,000 missing. Of our boys, only 7 years after World War II, we're already in World War II and a half. And I think the women are alarmed when they discover that the president, by his own admission, has no plan at all for ending the Korean War. In fact, from all the president says, and Mr. Stevenson, you get the impression that they're sort of going to stabilize this war for an indefinite period. And I think women feel that Eisenhower can bring this war to an honorable end.
Allison was a legal assistant with much bigger dreams. Eric turned his business background into so much more. They found their futures at the Massachusetts School of Law, and so can you. Immerse yourself in a fun, supportive campus environment. Learn professional skills from instructors with real-world experience. Take the first step in changing your life at the most affordable law school in New England, the Massachusetts School of Law at Andover. Your future starts here.
The CIA is alleged to have sent this P-51 fighter against Indonesian President Sukarno in 1958. Sukarno then captured an American pilot named Alan Pope. Pope had been flying a B-26 bomber for anti-Sukarno rebels while working for the CIA.
Well, all I can tell you is that we were not very happy with Mr. Sukarno in, what was that year, 1958, and I don't think we were very happy with him in 1965.
The Congo is a natural and deadly battleground for American and Russian agents. The latest CIA help to the central government is an air force piloted by Cubans.
Is it possible that there may have been American agents in the Congo who turned up later in Laos? I mean, are these men on both sides engaged in these battles around the world?
Oh, yes.
Do they meet? Do they?
Well, if they meet too much and are seen too much, then they use their utility.
Even in Tibet, where rebels fight the Chinese communists, there is the CIA. If it would help, the CIA would recruit the abominable snowman.
Well, I'm not going to go into the Tibet situation separately because we might have got started wandering all around the world, and I would be going beyond what I know about. I do think that there are times where the supporting of movements that are favorable to you in a murky situation is one of the best ways of preventing that movement from becoming the communist movement from taking over.
Here's another thing that you say. Story is about exceptionalism, the view that the United States is inherently more moral and farther seeing than other countries, and therefore may behave in ways that others should not. It also addresses the belief that because of its immense power, the United States can not only topple governments, but guide the course of history. Can you elaborate on that?
Sometimes I think Americans feel that our country is so unusual, that's so truly unique, that we've actually transcended the cycles of history. That there's no point in looking back in history for warnings or examples of what might happen to us because we're so different from any country or empire that's ever existed. But this isn't true. Actually, the history shows that all great nations and empires have had ups and downs. Countries that have survived over many, many centuries, like, say, Iran or China, are used to this. They understand that when things aren't going well, even if that goes on for a century or two, the cycles of history will bring them up again. They can look back over 20, 40 centuries. Then you develop an understanding for this. But Americans are not used to this. The arc of American history is quite misleading. It tells us that we always get richer and stronger and more powerful and more beloved. But that's never happened with any country in history. And I think right now we're at the moment where we're starting to realize that that won't be our fate forever. I'm not sure we're psychologically prepared for this, for the fact that the U.S. is not going to be able to dictate the way the world runs indefinitely. It's important for us to recognize that cycles of history also affect us, and not to be thrown into a panic when we realize that other forces in the world are emerging and that at least our relative power is inevitably going to decline over time.
The beloved part strikes me as, oh boy, we are not beloved. At least in many places we are not beloved. You add something else of enormous interest. It says, the Dulles brothers added two other convictions, both bred into them over many years. One was missionary Christianity, which tells believers that they understand eternal truths and have an obligation to convert the unenlightened. Alongside it was the presumption that protecting the right of large American corporations to operate freely in the world is good for everyone. I mean, those are so contradictory that you just have to laugh. But anyhow, why don't you elaborate them?
One of the reasons I find the story of the Dulles brothers so fascinating is that they really reflect America. The forces that shaped John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles are the forces that shaped this country. And when we understand them, I think we understand our country better, and we understand better why we behave the way we do in the world. So what were those forces? I think there were three important ones. First of all, they grew up in this very elite environment. Their grandfather had been Secretary of State, their uncle was Secretary of State. Before they'd even reached their teens, they were sitting around at dinner parties in Washington with Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson and Bernard Baruch and William Howard Taft and ambassadors and senators. Through these experiences, they assimilated this idea of American exceptionalism. Their grandfather had been a pioneer and risen through the ranks of power. He perceived of America's uniqueness as the explanation for why we deserved to cover all of North America. And they took that belief and extended it to the whole world. So this belief in the exceptional nature of the United States, that we had a providential mission on earth that allowed us to behave in ways that we wouldn't want others to behave, was one important factor that shaped them. And that also shapes our country. Second one is, as you mentioned, missionary Calvinism. Calvinism teaches you that there's one true faith and all the other religions are wrong. And if you believe that about religion, it's actually a short step to believing the same thing about politics, that there's one political system that's good and all the others are bad. And then the missionary aspect teaches you that you can't just sit home and hope that those bad countries become good. You have to go out there and change them. And the third factor that shaped them definitely was their decades of work representing the largest American multinational corporations at this law firm in New York, Sullivan and Cromwell. They came to view their job as protecting the right of American corporations to invest and be active and extract resources from and have markets in foreign countries. And they measured how free a country was by how much freedom it gave to American companies to operate there. So those three factors, the belief in American exceptionalism, the missionary Calvinist ideal, and the service of American corporations, shaped them, and I think shaped us and our foreign policy.
Religiosity was an everyday matter in their homes. These people came there and ate dinner, and so they were exposed to this all the time. And I think it was Allie who once, when he was a very little boy, 8 or 9, he'd go upstairs and he'd write down what people had said, which for a kid that age, this is not normal.
It's quite a remarkable story. He'd be at these dinner parties given by his grandfather for all these eminent figures, and then the boys couldn't participate in the dinner because they were just little kids, but they listened, and then they would go up and go to bed, except Allen, future CIA director, did not go to bed. He'd write what were essentially intelligence reports to himself of who was there, what did they say, and what did they really mean behind what they said. Here's a kid who's like 9 years old writing this. You begin to wonder what goes on inside a mind like that.
Well, you sure do. I mean, that's awfully young to be au courant with that those kinds of notions, or to have them in your head.
believe it was Tom Paine who once contributed the statement that the cause of America is the cause of mankind. Do you think it might be hopeful if we would start with a declaration that we Americans are going to aid the cause of freedom throughout the world again?
I think it's well timed that we should make that clear again. As long as we stood for that in the world, we were on the offensive, the despots were on the defensive, we were secure. During that 100 years, there was no peril to this country. We've only begun to have our peril during the last 50 years when we've become rich and strong and fat and more interested in keeping the things we had than in giving other people freedom.
Stuck in a cubicle, Jess was going nowhere. Carol made the switch from a tech company. Everald was an undergrad who knew he wanted more. He deserved more. Find your future at the Massachusetts School of Law. Immerse yourself in a fun, supportive campus environment. Learn professional skills from instructors with real-world experience. Take the first step in changing your life at the most affordable law school in New England, the Massachusetts School of Law at Andover. Your future starts here.
Well, Mr. Dulles, I'd like to get back to some specific questions on this Japanese peace treaty. Now, one question that's been raised is this. It's been feared that the Japanese will very much need trade with China. And because of this need for trade, that they'll be tempted to recognize and deal with the Chinese communists. Do you have any comment to make on that?
Yes, you've got 85 million people almost on Japan. Pretty barren islands. They can't grow their own food or their own material for clothing or anything of that sort. They got to live some way. Now, there are plenty of opportunities for them to live and to live well in trade with Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. They don't have to trade with China. They have not traded with China for the last 5 years to amount to anything, and they've improved their economic condition tremendously. Now, if the free world is irresponsible and cuts Japan out from all of their markets, then the Japanese will be faced with a hard choice. They'll either have to play along with communism or starve to death.
John Foster was a very self-righteous and judgmental person. Maybe you could elaborate on that and who and what he viewed in a self-righteous and judgmental light and why, and etc.
Yeah, Foster Dulles and his brother, I think, were actually not intensely creative thinkers. They were intelligent in a certain way. Certainly Foster Dulles mastered astonishing details about international finance, but they weren't creative thinkers in the sense of reacting to their environment. Everything they believed when they were 10 years old, that's what they believed until the day they died. So they were not open to new ideas. Now, one of the things that definitely shaped their world in the 50s when they were at their peak of power was not only their inbred hatred of Bolshevism, which was quite understandable and widely shared, but another concept they developed, which was that there was a force in the world perhaps even more dangerous than Bolshevism, and that was what they called neutralism. So as we saw the world in the 50s, as Americans saw it, the great factor shaping everything in the world was the conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. And as far as the Dulles brothers were concerned, everything that happened in the world had to be a product of that conflict. When a land reform act was passed in Guatemala, for example, it was not possible for the Dulles brothers to imagine that this was simply a Guatemalan idea and that it responded to a Guatemalan problem. They assumed that since it had a negative impact on a big American company, United Fruit, it must have been ordered from the Kremlin. They couldn't believe that the Guatemalans would just come up with this themselves. So Arbenz, the president of Guatemala, was one of these neutralists like Sukarno in Indonesia, or Nasser in Egypt, or Nehru in India, or Lumumba in the Congo. There were a whole series of these leaders, and they didn't see the world as shaped by the conflict between Moscow and Washington. They saw a different conflict, As far as they saw the world, it was all about the new, young countries that were emerging from colonialism, clashing against the old, established powers that wanted to keep them down. So when Foster Dulles looked around the world at these neutralist leaders, he did not see patriotic nationalists who took over backward countries and were trying to develop them and didn't want to get involved in world affairs because they wanted to concentrate on their own countries. He saw something very different. He believed that as the Kremlin looked around the world, they realized there were some countries they couldn't take over right now. So they told their lackeys in those countries, rise to power, but don't tell them you're working for us. Pretend that you're just a local nationalist, and then when the right time comes, we'll call you and tell you to seize the country for communism. This was a complete fantasy, but it was impossible for the Dulles brothers to imagine that these nationalists were simply products of their own countries in their own times. So in this sense, I think they had a very uncreative and narrow-minded view of the world.
How can you be so, I hate to use the word blind, but maybe it fits, to reality and to what's going on elsewhere?
I think one reason is that they grew up in an elite and they never really stepped outside that elite. They truly believed that they and this small group of people, all very similar types, who essentially directed American foreign policy for the whole first half of the 20th century and beyond, were the only ones who saw the world correctly. If you differed from them, it meant that you were wrong, and the more you differed from them, the more wrong you were. The idea that they would sit and listen to people with different perspectives never entered their mind. And in fact, I think this was one of the great dangers inherent in having two brothers in these very sensitive positions. They grew up so intimately. They saw the world exactly the same way. Therefore, they reinforced each other and created a kind of a closed circle that no other voice could enter. They both understood the truth about the world, so what would be the point of consulting anyone else? As a result, when they decided to overthrow a government in, say, Iran or Guatemala, they wouldn't call in the Iran experts in the State Department or the Guatemala experts. In fact, in both of those cases, the CIA station chief on the ground told them, don't do this. This is not going to work out well for us. Rather than listen to their own guy, they fired those guys and brought in people who were more ignorant and would repeat what they wanted to hear.
And Eisenhower was on board.
Absolutely. There's no doubt that he fully supported this project, although he never made that clear. Eisenhower was a budget cutter, and he had a security policy called the New Look. It was a way of cutting down the size of the army to save money. So the New Look had two pillars, smaller army and nuclear deterrent to replace it. But we now know that the New Look actually had three pillars. It was smaller army, nuclear deterrent, and covert action.
The nuclear deterrent part was, I don't know whether to call it stupid or what to call it, because nobody was going to start World War III over something that happened in Guatemala.
Although we pretended we would.
Yeah.
Foster Dulles had this concept called massive retaliation.
Yeah.
And that was exactly what you pointed out, that if there was some trouble in some place like Guatemala, there'd be no limit to our retaliation. Nobody ever believed this. This was a concept that was completely devoid of meaning. Like his other concepts, he had this concept of the agonizing reappraisal. That was towards Europe. If Europe wasn't going to be 100% anti-communist and anti-Moscow, we would agonizingly reappraise whether we really wanted to support Europe. That wasn't true either. Of course we were going to continue supporting our European allies. So his rhetoric far outstripped reality.
Yeah. Now, who was Alex Gaunt, and what was his effect on the Dulleses?
Gaunt was a British intelligence officer who came to work in the United States. And Allen Dulles, as a young man, got to meet him. Allen Dulles was fascinated by him. He had this diffuse interest in the inner workings of people's minds, but I don't think he really understood what intelligence was as a business, because the United States in those days didn't have a peacetime intelligence service. But Gaunt, to him, was just the epitome of this fascinating swashbuckler who operated behind the scenes. And I think Allen Dulles wanted to be like him. Allen Dulles also had a favorite book. He liked this book, Kim, by Rudyard Kipling, which is sort of a book for young adults. It's essentially about a young kid who grows up to realize that being a secret agent for the British is the real way to serve the cause of humanity. Alan loved this book, and it was even on his bed table when he died. It's one of these childish fantasies, like the James Bond books that he loved, that allowed him to believe there's never going to be any bad effect to covert action, and in fact, it's good for everybody.
I want to read you a paragraph you wrote that one hardly knows what to think. It says, around the same time, Ali was informed by British officers that a young Czech woman he was dating, who worked with him at the American legation and had access to his code room, was passing information to Austrian agents. They had decided, the British officers had decided, she must be liquidated, and he understood it as a necessity of wartime counter-espionage. One night he took her to dinner, and then, instead of squiring her home, delivered her to two British agents who were waiting in front of the 14th century Nideg church. She was never heard from again. What kind of a person does that?
Quite a way to end a date.
Yeah, boy, forever.
Yeah, Alan was one tough guy. I spin this forward to the period in the 1950s when he was running the CIA. One of his major projects was sending exile groups of fighters into places like Soviet Georgia, Soviet Latvia, Albania, to try to stir up trouble. Every single agent that he sent was immediately captured and killed. This never bothered him. And when he was asked about it, he would shrugged and said, well, at least we're getting experience for the next war. So he sent people off to die without any real qualms, and I think without even insisting that there be some real benefit, some real possible positive outcome to it. There was never any prospect that 6 kids landing on the beach in Albania were going to overthrow the Albanian government. But just the fact that they would be there, even if they only lasted a couple of hours, he thought might send a message to the communists. So that was worth sacrificing lives for. And then multiply that times the lives that have been lost in places like Guatemala over the last 50 years, and you get into the tens, even hundreds of thousands of deaths for which he can be held indirectly responsible.
You know, one wishes to think, and we've been acculturated, I believe, to think that before people are sent on these kinds of missions, there's a great deal of thinking, soul searching, and so forth that goes on about the missions and the possibilities of success and how to avoid the deaths of the people on the mission. Essentially, you're saying that's a lot of baloney. He just sent them off. That's it.
That's right. That was really, there was none of that serious thinking. Now, we now realize that one of the reasons that soldiers were waiting to pick up every one of those insurgents or rebels or would-be fomenters of dissent was that the chief representative of British intelligence to the CIA, Kim Philby, was actually working for the Russians. And he knew all these plans, and he would just send them the note telling them what beach to be waiting on when these kids landed. That happened over and over, but it never led Allen Dulles to start to think maybe something was wrong.
It's fantastic. It's just fantastic. You say that Foster Dulles and Sullivan and Cromwell played a role in the Cuban intervention by Robert Lansing. And maybe you could discuss that, what the intervention was, what Lansing did, what role the Dulles brothers played.
100 times in his career at Sullivan and Cromwell, Foster Dulles did what Sullivan and Cromwell lawyers were hired to do. That was not a law firm like you assume what that phrase means. It had a specialty. They could do things like represent you in court or draw up a contract like other law firms, but that's not their specialty. Nobody hired them for that. Sullivan and Cromwell had a distinct specialty, which was forcing small countries to do what big American companies wanted them to do. And that's why every major American multinational corporation hired Sullivan and Cromwell. Whenever you had a problem in a country, they would go fix it. That was what you hired them for. Foster Dulles and his brother did this countless times, and I just use this one example at the very beginning of Foster Dulles' career, when he was still a young lawyer at Sullivan and Cromwell in 1917. There had been an election in Cuba. The Liberal Party, which was much more popular, had won the election, and the incumbent conservatives had lost. But the conservatives favored granting American corporations all the privileges they wanted, and the liberals favored limiting the amount of land that foreign companies could own. So some of that land could be divided up and given to poor Cuban families. That's why they won the election. So the American corporations told their friends in government in Cuba, don't leave office. We know you lost the election, but ignore that, stay in power, because we don't want the liberals in. The liberals then began a rebellion. The companies then went to Sullivan and Cromwell. They said, we have a problem in Cuba. We've hired you to solve our problems. Get rid of this rebellion. So John Foster Dulles got the case. The next morning, he got on the train in New York, and he went to Washington to see Uncle Bert. Uncle Bert was known to the rest of us as the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing. He went to see his uncle and explained the situation. The uncle said, what should we do? And young Foster said, well, I think we should send some warships to Cuba to put down that rebellion. The next day, 2 American warships were sent to Cuba. They landed 5,000 troops. They put down the liberal rebellion. The liberals figured there was no point in fighting against the U.S. military. That began a 5-year occupation of Cuba, all intended to be sure Cuba was stable for American corporations. Now, of course, Foster Dulles would have left thinking, I did my job, I served the company's interests, and it all worked out. But if you look at what happened in Cuba decades later, and look what has happened to Cuba in recent decades, you'll realize it didn't all work out. Actually, Cubans got very angry about that. They couldn't do anything in 1914 or in 1917 or in the 20s and 30s and 40s, but in the 50s, Cuba finally exploded and came under the leadership of a radically anti-American regime. Why was it so radically anti-American? All you have to do is look back and see the history of American interventions there, including this one led by Foster Dulles when he was a private lawyer, and you understand why they began to feel that independent Cuba can never be achieved unless it's done in a way that reduces American influence.
And so you're speaking of Castro, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Castro is the long-term result of all of our interventions in Cuba. In fact, when in 1898, we promised to allow Cuba to become independent as soon as they got free of Spain. Then we changed our mind. 60 years later, when Castro took over, in his very first speech, he said, this time it's not going to be like 1898 when the Americans came in and took over our country. So that shows you that these interventions become a part of the consciousness of people, and the inability to recognize or understand this was a real mental shortcoming of the Dulles brothers.
Now, just so I don't get some nasty phone calls, Sullivan and Cromwell has metamorphosed, I think that's the right word, decades and decades ago into a what you would call a normal Wall Street law firm.
Yeah, Sullivan and Cromwell, it's still one of the biggest law firms in America, but as you say, it has now branched out, and sometimes I think it's not really necessary anymore to have a law firm to crash into other countries and make them safe for American business, because that's what our government does now.
Okay.
The Suez Canal, storm center of controversy for weeks, now becomes a cause of war in a lightning sequence of diplomatic and military moves. Since its seizure and nationalization by President Nasser of Egypt, the vital waterway has precipitated a new crisis in the already tense Middle East. Crack French units are embarked at Marseille, bound for a joint staging area with Great Britain on Cyprus, less than an hour's flight from Egyptian ports, where they are prepared for seizure of the canal by force. Simultaneously, Britain reinforces its garrison on the island for the same eventuality. A naval concentration in the eastern Mediterranean strengthens the military buildup, even as Israel, in a lightning attack, thrusts deep into Egypt to the vicinity of the canal. France and Britain issue a 12-hour ultimatum that all fighting must cease. Within hours of its expiration, Britain's warplanes are winging their way to Egypt, and its bombers attack 5 key cities, including Cairo.
Following a Security Council veto by Britain and France of a United States motion for a ceasefire, President Eisenhower, after consultation with Secretary of State Dulles, makes a firm declaration of United States policy.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. In the circumstances I have described, there will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities.
Over 25 years ago, we said legal education was broken. Change is uncomfortable, but it's often needed. So we rolled up our sleeves and we fixed it. Schools are just too expensive. Ours isn't. Most schools don't teach needed professional skills. Ours does because our professors continue to have real-world experience. Too often, you settle for a career that's less than what you hoped for. You shouldn't. Come see the future. The Massachusetts School of Law at Andover. Your future starts here.
Secretary of State Dulles arrives in Ankara for the meeting of the Baghdad Alliance and finds the Turkish capital a troubled city. 2 bombs, set off just a few hours before his arrival, blasted American property, the American Publications Bureau, and a warehouse wall inside the embassy compound. Foreign agents are blamed, for Turkey is staunchly pro-Western. But the incident sounded a grim note for the opening of a council meeting designed to steady the somewhat shaky alliance. Problems facing the council include the desire of its members that America formally join and supply greater aid. Neither desire was satisfied, but progress was made. America pledged $10 million for a new communications network, and the first steps were taken for a unified command of all Baghdad-packed forces.
What was the effect or the relationships between Wilson and the Dulleses and Bernard Baruch's relationship with John Foster Dulles?
Bernard Baruch was kind of a legendary deal maker and Wall Street wunderkind who helped, I think, bring Foster Dulles up into the top rank of international finance, and he actually hired Foster Dulles to ghostwrite one of his books.
It was basically, not big. Originally, he was like a South Carolinian or something,
yeah.
Was he not?
Mm-hmm. It was through contact with this elite that the Dulles brothers rose into the positions that they held. Now, both of them had gone to Princeton. Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton. In fact, he had been a teacher of Foster Dulles. And of course, Wilson was this grand utopian. In some ways, you think of him as the opposite of the Dulles brothers because he was so idealistic and they were so cynical. But in fact, they both shared some fundamental beliefs. Essentially, they were great products of American exceptionalism. Both Wilson and the Dulles brothers believed fervently that the United States had the key to success for all countries in the world. And if other countries would become more and more like the United States, they would become more happier, more prosperous, and be able to provide better lives for their people and stability for the world. It never occurred to them that other countries have other cultures, other countries have different ideas about what constitutes a good life, and that the American system doesn't fit everybody.
Where did they get off thinking that, I mean, I've loaded the question right there, but where did they get off thinking that our way is the only way and everybody must do it our way?
I think it came from this deep sense of our manifest destiny inside North America. And we did have this belief all during the 18th and 19th centuries that it was our destiny to spread from coast to coast. So we were essentially expanding ever since the Pilgrims landed. Then at the end of the 19th century, we filled up North America. Then I think we really had a big turning point as a nation. We had to ask ourselves, So are we finished now? Or do we keep going? The way that we looked at Native Americans and Mexicans, who we cleared off of North America, it was the same way that we began to look at people in other countries. They're poor, backward children. And although they may think and say that they want to be independent and they have their own ways, actually they're too childish to be able to make such a decision. We are the ones who know best for them. And actually, when we overrule their will and we brush aside their aspirations and impose our aspirations, we're actually helping them because they think they know what's best for them, but we actually know what's best for them.
It's a kind of hubris that's staggering, really. But as you say, it stems from a lot of successful history.
And I would add that this is not a strange little belief that just a few people had. The Dulles brothers did not hijack American foreign policy and make the United States do things that nobody wanted us to do. They represented what was probably the last general consensus about foreign policy in our history. Everybody was trained and inculcated to see the world the same way. The mass media, the loose empire, everybody was preaching the same view of the world. And anybody offering a counter view was viewed as strangely subversive. During that period, if you even talked about troubles inside the United States, if you complained about racial injustice, for example, or you defended labor unions, you were already considered suspect because it was immediately thought that you were kind of off the program. And the Dulleses were very successful in maintaining that discipline inside the United States and making sure that truly dissenting voices were not heard.
Was it you who said, and if so, in the last line of the book, they are us and we are they?
Yes, I think it's too easy for us to read stories like the stories of the Dulles brothers and say, oh, that was a couple of bad guys. And we have this fantasy, not only about America, but about other countries, that if you could just peel off the layer of a few bad actors, everybody would be happy and live like in Switzerland. That was our approach in Iraq. Just get rid of Saddam Hussein and about 10 other bad people, then everyone in Iraq will become pro-American and it'll look just like Switzerland. There's a fantasy that's very deep here, and it has to do with being so self-centered that you believe everybody wants to be like you and should be like you. It's the idea that there's only one real good way to run a country, one good way to have a life, and that's the way that me and my best friends have. The Dulleses and the people who ran American foreign policy in those days were all white Protestant males who went to the same private schools, the same law schools. They went to work for the same law firms and investment banks. Those were the only two professions in that business. They vacationed in the same places. They married the same women. They went to the same parties. It was a very inbred group, and anybody that didn't fit was seen as being on some kind of a lower level, not a different level.
What did the Brits think about all that?
The British were very unhappy with the Dulles brothers. As a matter of fact, the British Foreign Secretary even wrote a letter to Eisenhower asking him not to appoint John Foster Dulles. But I give you
Anthony Eden?
It was Anthony Eden, yeah. I give you one example of why the British were so unhappy with the Dulles brothers. So one of the principal beliefs of John Foster Dulles and his brother was never negotiate with your enemies, particularly in this case the Soviets. You never want to have any contact with them. And the reason that Foster Dulles believed this was that he felt, perhaps correctly, that the entire Cold War paradigm rested on the idea of immutable, permanent hostility between Moscow and Washington. You had to believe that the Soviets represented such a threat as had never emerged in all of human history. It was not a threat just to our political system, but to all of civilization, that everything evil would come from any advance by the Soviets. Therefore, if you started to see photographs as an American citizen of American and Soviet leaders sitting together, or the American president greeting the Soviet leader, you might start to think, well, actually, the Soviets are people just like us. We're going to give them ideas, they'll give us their ideas, and we're going to talk about them, and we're going to see if we can reach some conclusion. if you start thinking like that, the whole Cold War paradigm dissolves. So, after Stalin died in 1953, the U.S. started to get peace feelers from the Kremlin. The Kremlin was interested in some changing relationship with the West. At the end of 1953, there was a summit in Bermuda by what was then called the Big Three. So that was France, Britain, United States. And that was one of the agenda items. They had received a message from Molotov, the interim Soviet leader. He wanted to have a summit where they would call it the Big Four. So France, Britain, US, and Soviet Union. Churchill thought this was a great idea. He was all for it. But and the French were for it too, but Foster Dulles was absolutely against it, and that summit never happened. Churchill went home very frustrated and angry at Dulles because he saw that Dulles was too interested in maintaining the paradigm of hostility to explore any way of getting out of it.
Makes nonsense of a lot of the things that we believed for many, many years.
Seeks to gain support among the Muslims and among the younger army officers outside the city of Algiers, where the leaders of the May uprising are still powerful. If the general secures broad support, he may move farther towards solving France's gravest problem. In Paris, after de Gaulle's return, Secretary of State Dulles arrives, bearing an invitation from President Eisenhower for a Washington visit, when de Gaulle gets the problems of his nation under control. The talks between Dulles and de Gaulle brought general agreement on the world situation, but left one area of disagreement. De Gaulle wants France to develop her own atomic weapons, in keeping with her standing as a great nation. Dulles' reservation, another atomic power and a new series of nuclear tests might jeopardize all hopes for disarmament. And under existing law, Dulles can offer de Gaulle no atomic know-how.
I remember the day my future started. Walking with Bo, thinking about my life. I had big dreams, but my career was going nowhere. That's when I discovered the Massachusetts School of Law. A few years later, I'm here with Bo, but now I'm thinking about my clients' problems instead of my own.
Teachers with real-world experience, a fun campus, and the most affordable law school in New England. Change your life. The Massachusetts School of Law at Andover. Your future starts here.
Mr. Dulles, because we on this program hear so much that's not hopeful, I would like for us to come back again to this point. Do you expect that we Americans can do something hopeful, and do you think that we will do something hopeful for the world in the way of enunciating a new policy?
I'm absolutely convinced, Mr. Huey, that we can. We've been looking at this whole world picture through the wrong end of the telescope. We just see our own troubles, our own weaknesses, and the other fellow looks strong and solid and invulnerable. If we turn the telescope around and look at it the right way, we would see the amazing resources that we have, the hope that we can inspire in people. We would see the oppression of the despotism there, the fact that even within Russia there are 15 million people in captive prison camps. They only ruled by terrorism. Why, that situation ought to be a pushover. It would have been a pushover in the old days.
Well, Mr. Dulles, I'm sure that our audience very much appreciates this hopeful message of yours, sir. Thank you, sir, for being with us.
You say that, I think it was John Foster, wrote 600 secret memos to the Department of State. 600 secret memos?
It's remarkable to me as I began to learn this story that all through the 20s and 30s and into the 40s, the State Department was really a very small institution. And as American corporations began to spread around the world, they were dissatisfied with what was going on in the State Department. You just had a handful of people that were mainly interested in diplomacy, whereas they thought the real interest of Washington should be to make the world safe for American corporations. So they began to develop their own quiet institutions. And actually, that's how the Council on Foreign Relations began. The Dulles brothers were co-founders of that. And in those days, that wasn't just another think tank. That was really a repository of power that was impervious to anybody outside the group. Anybody that was female or Catholic or any way different from them had no hope of penetrating that. And then there was even a subgroup within the Council on Foreign Relations that developed this secret pipeline to the State Department. And these guys would write reports telling the State Department what to do. And in many cases, they had better sources in the world than the State Department did. But of course, their recommendations were not aimed at promoting America's national interests, but rather promoting the corporate interests that they represented. So having such a network and being so powerful, and the State Department being so relatively weak and small, this group of investment bankers and lawyers and international corporate executives essentially shaped American foreign policy for decades.
I'm tempted to ask, where in the hell were the rest of us? But where were the rest of us?
You know, I think the answer to that question is that everybody came out of the Second World War with a momentary sense that there might be a pause, an end to world tension, but suddenly we were told that we had a new enemy. And I think we projected onto the Soviets, with the help and encouragement of people like the Dulles brothers, the worst things about our World War II enemies. But in particular, two things. So Hitler had mass concentration camps in which he wiped out millions of civilians just on a whim. So the Soviets probably would be the same. They'd be doing the same thing. The Japanese attacked us without warning when we weren't even at war with them. So the Soviets would probably do that too. So all the worst things that we saw during World War II, we picked up and were told to project onto the Soviet Union. In fact, it was a steady theme of American popular press and public opinion in those days that the Soviets were actually far more evil than the Nazis or Japanese could ever have dreamed of being. And not having any real alternative sources of information, I think Americans all bought into this. This book that I've written about the Dulles brothers could not have been written in earlier decades because the processes that they set in motion that had such terrible effects hadn't had all those terrible effects right away. It took time for us to realize how devastating were the seeds that the Dulles brothers had planted. And part of my goal in writing this book is to make Americans realize what long-term effects our interventions can have and not to make the same mistake now. They could at least argue, if we could have them here, we didn't know that these kinds of covert operations would have such huge long-term effects because 50 years before us, there hadn't been any covert operations. We just landed the Marines. But we don't have that excuse today. We can look back at what's happened as a result of what they did and realize that that should be a warning for how we behave in the world today.
Stephen, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciated it, and your books are always fascinating.
You certainly make them seem that way.
No, I don't make them seem anyway. They are fascinating.
Thank you.
But anyhow, thank you for saying so. Thank you for being with us today for the first segment of our discussion of The Brothers by Stephen Kinzer. And be with us again next time when we will finish with this book, which is, as you know, a dual biography of the Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. I hope you enjoyed it, and we're certainly happy that you watched it, and be with us again next time.